Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, June 12th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election forecast. FiveThirtyEight just yesterday released a long-awaited forecast, one that we've used back in 2020 and in 2022, that has given us a general estimation as to where this election might end up. And in a surprise to many, the FiveThirtyEight forecast reveals that President Biden wins in the majority of predicted outcomes this coming November in a 2024 presidential election matchup. In contrast with a lot of the polls that we've been seeing on both the national level, but also in swing states, with Trump being up by 4 in Arizona, 5 in Nevada, 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in Michigan, 2 in Pennsylvania, 5 in North Carolina, and 5 in Georgia. The FiveThirtyEight forecast today showing that President Biden is in the advantage certainly shocks some, but isn't super surprising when it comes down to how they do their methodology and what we can honestly expect this coming November. Now, the President Biden is in the lead when it comes down to the FiveThirtyEight forecast. Regardless of that, this election is close. It's 53-47, and the estimations here are pretty favorable to President Trump, especially given where it was back in 2020 and what he saw in 2016. Now, in 2016, the numbers there looked a lot better for President Trump. He had a 33% chance of victory, ultimately ended up winning with that 1/3 chance. Then in 2020, it reduced down to roughly 10%, ultimately ended up losing the election. And so FiveThirtyEight was right in 2020, but wrong in 2016. Now, I want to take a look back at the 2020 forecast and also the most recent 2022 forecast, just to give you a better understanding of where we are. I will say, too, Nate Silver, who used to be very well known for being a member of FiveThirtyEight, being part of the FiveThirtyEight team, is no longer part of FiveThirtyEight, and so he's not leading this forecast. Actually, he is supposedly going to be releasing his own forecast sometime in the future, but right now we're focused on FiveThirtyEight, which is operating under G. Elliott Morris, who ran the Economist forecast from 2020, and so if you remember that in 2022 as well, you saw that the Economist forecast then was run by the person who is now running FiveThirtyEight. And so we're back at this point where Biden is up on this one, but let's take a look back at 2020, since largely speaking, models don't change too drastically, and they often do a good job at predicting the overall outcome of the election. And so in 2020, President Biden was favored to win the election. In 9 times out of 10, according to FiveThirtyEight, President Biden was going to win. But it's these individual swing states that I think revealed where some of the more accurate predictions came in and where some of the less accurate predictions came in. For instance, when you take a look at the map here, the winding pathway to 270, you found the Democrats already surpassed that quite easily on the FiveThirtyEight forecast. Their closest state was accurately predicted, and that it would be the state of Georgia. Then it was supposedly Maine's 2nd district, which ultimately went to Trump. Then it was going to be North Carolina, which ultimately went to Trump. Then it was going to be Florida, again went to Trump. Arizona was next, that was correct. Nebraska's 2nd was actually larger than the next state, which was Pennsylvania, and then Nevada and Michigan and Wisconsin. And so while the margins were off, the overall victor was correct in many of these states. The very few examples in which we saw that President Biden was losing this forecast was in states like North Carolina, where he was supposed to win, ultimately ended up not winning, in states like Florida, where he was projected to win, ultimately ended up not winning, right? And so what you found was that in 2020, the FiveThirtyEight forecast was largely correct, but did have some inaccuracies and did underestimate President Trump when it came down to some of these battleground states. With that being said, though, they got the overall victor correct. In 2022, though, they overestimated Republican support. In the House of Representatives, they gave Democrats just a 16% chance of victory. And while that largely was what ended up being true, when it came down to their projected margins and some of the states, they expected Republicans to win roughly 230 seats in the House of Representatives. Republicans only ended up winning 222. So it was an underestimation for Democrats, a quite significant one if you ask me, and they said Republicans would win the national popular vote by roughly 4 points. Ended up being less than 3. But when it came down to the Senate elections, it was arguably the most egregious incorrect forecast from 2022 from FiveThirtyEight. They said Republicans had a 59% chance of victory, and while things that have a 41% chance of victory happen all the time, it wasn't just that Democrats maintained Senate control, they actually expanded it. When you take a look at some of these battleground states, they were far more underestimating of Democrats than I think they should have been when it came down to this forecast. For instance, in a state like Pennsylvania, Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, had a 57% chance of victory. John Fetterman was supposed to lose by 1 point. He won by 5. And so that's a 6-point swing relative to the 2022 election forecast. Okay, moving on. What do we have next? The state of Nevada, where Adam Laxalt is supposedly going to defeat Catherine Cortez Masto. Well, fast forward to now, didn't happen. We saw that he was supposed to lose by 0.2. He ended up win by 0.2. He ultimately ended up losing by 0.8. And so that's a 1-point swing across the state. And the most egregious inaccuracy was in the state of Georgia, where they said Herschel Walker had a 63% chance of victory and that he was going to win by 1.2%. And he ended up losing the runoff election by over 2 points, nearly a 4-point swing across the state. And so for me, when I take a look at the forecast from 2022 combined with that of 2020, I would largely say 538 is correct in most instances, but has it displayed in the years 2020 and 2022, both underestimating Democrats, but also underestimating Republicans. Now let's take a look at what the 2020 forecast has to tell us, because they say again that President Biden is in the advantage. Now keep in mind, this is out of multiple simulations of the 2024 presidential election, and Joe Biden leads Donald Trump when it comes down to this overall forecast. What they have here is that they are including fundamental indicators as part of this forecast, believing that President Biden will pull his predicted margin here from being down just 1 point to up roughly 2, a 3-point swing between now and election day, largely in line with what we've been seeing when it comes down to battleground states. The question is, can he replicate it on the national level? But what we're interested at here isn't necessarily about what is driving this forecast, but rather what the forecast is actually telling us. Now, we have this tracker over time. While the forecast wasn't released and the forecast wasn't public, we didn't have the ability to take a look at it from, back then, back in April, when they're looking at this forecast that shows President Biden in arguably a better position than he is in today. And so this consistent trend line here seems to have shown that President Biden's lead has really dropped off from where it was at the earlier stages of the forecast. But at one point in time, Donald Trump actually had nearly the upper hand over Joe Biden. On one day, on June 3rd, just a week and a half ago, President Trump actually led Joe Biden when it came down to this forecast. Today, President Biden is expected to win 274 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 264. Now, when it comes down to victories in states, I've actually gone ahead and wiped our map here from our 2024 election prediction, kept all of the safe Democratic and Republican states, but allowed ourselves to take a look at some of the more narrow states. 232 electoral votes that we can characterize by looking at a map like this one. And so we're going to use the same characterizations that they use. Likely Republican, safe Republican, lean Republican. And I think we'll find here that some of these states show exactly what we've been talking about when it comes down to our forecast. To give you a bit of an overview of what it looked like prior to this map being filled in, we had Joe Biden winning the election with 271 electoral votes on my prediction. 538 has Biden at 274. And so it isn't too far off, and it has President Biden in the advantage point, but let's take a look at what we're looking at some of these battleground states. So Texas, likely red. Florida is actually lean Republican. Ohio is likely red. Iowa is likely red. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would argue that Florida should be in the likely red column. Right now it's lean red. I'm really just focused on here rushing through these states so we can get them on the map. North Carolina is lean red. Let's see if there's any other states here. New Hampshire is likely Biden, or actually lean Biden, just very narrowly in the lean column. Minnesota is lean. Virginia is likely. Colorado, New Mexico are likely. So we're going to go ahead and quickly characterize those. And again, you're starting to see that the map is panning out to be largely what we expect. Actually, the map here says that anything equal or above 75 is likely, so the state of New Hampshire is likely. Minnesota is a little bit closer. I'm going to check out Maine and Maine's 2nd district. I think we would find some interesting results there. Maine, Biden's likely. The 1st district, safe. 2nd district, likely Trump. So let's go ahead and do that. Maine at large, likely blue. Maine, 2nd district, likely Trump. And so that brings us down to these 7 states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. I'm interested to see who they expect to win here. Okay, so in Wisconsin, Biden is a toss-up, but narrowly in the advantage. Same thing in Michigan, same thing in Pennsylvania. You're talking very narrow advantages, so that means these states are tilt blue. And so that brings President Biden to a total 269 electoral votes. Nebraska's 2nd, however, is a lean Democratic characterization, which means we are already there. Now taking a look at states like Georgia, Trump is in the advantage point. Arizona, Trump is in the advantage point. Nevada, Trump is in the advantage point, all by tilt margins as well. And that brings us to our finalized, and also North Carolina, I believe, is lean. Yes, it is. Brings us to our finalized electoral map. I find this to be very, very interesting because it is nearly identical to what we are predicting on the national level. I mean, you could literally splat this onto my map and see that there is very little difference. And I think that's what's so interesting about this, is that while we've been taking a look at our own predictions and factoring in very different things than 538, but still sharing a lot of what they value and they look for when it comes down to an electoral prediction, the fact is our election projections are nearly the exact same. And it's so interesting. And so this is the map that we are expecting from 538, and it's a map that has become a lot more commonly talked about because this is Joe Biden's likeliest pathway to victory. He's not in the lead in states like Arizona. He's not in the lead in states like Georgia. I mean, you can take a look at the polls here. They aren't showing President Biden in a strong position. He's down 5 in Georgia, right? He's down 5 in Nevada. He's down 5 in Arizona, which makes these states much more likely to vote red. Now, what I do think, though, when you see the narrowing of the polls in states like Wisconsin, for instance, where you find that Trump is ahead by just 0.1, or Michigan, where Trump is ahead by 0.3, it makes a lot of sense that President Biden, however, is projected to win those states even with Trump in the advantage point. Because what 2022 showed us was that Democrats may not always turn out in those polls and say they're voting for the Democratic candidate. We also know, too, that people are becoming less and less responsive to election polls. Election responses have gone down to roughly 6-7% at max for top-tier polling firms, when they used to be anywhere between 20 to 30% 30, 40 years ago. And it has been this consistent decline where it has decreased compared to 2016. It's decreased compared to 2020. What we have found here is that not as many voters are willing to talk to polling groups. And so sometimes the data isn't super correct. And so when we find other metrics that show that Biden and the Democratic Party at large are doing better in some of these states, that's the data that I think is also competing with some of these polls that are showing negative results for President Biden, which is largely why I believe President Biden still has that upper hand when it comes down to 538. I'm thinking about examples like the Ohio 6th Congressional District special election, where Democrats saw a phenomenal overperformance, a 20-point swing to the left relative to 2022, and yet all of our media narrative because of these polls have been saying Trump's going to win. There is no pathway for Biden. Maybe he should drop out. Maybe he's not the viable candidate that he once was. But yet Democrats are? It doesn't make sense, at least to me, considering that the whole idea here is that every election since Joe Biden has taken office has always been a referenda against President Biden until it isn't. It has always been Republicans should expect a red wave until they shouldn't. It is always, always, always incredibly pro-Republican until the actual results seem to show otherwise. This happened in 2022, this happened in 2023, and it is happening again in 2024. The Dobbs v. Jackson decision changed everything. It put so much back on the table for the National Democratic Party and completely reworked what it meant to be a high-propensity voter. And Democrats have been clearly turning out and turning up when it comes down to their elections. What's to say this November won't be any different? When you look at this forecast, too, I think it tells us the margins here, that we should expect President Biden and President Trump to win them by. And while I did overall percentage here, I want to switch over to margin because I think it could show even more of an interesting map, because that's what I use when it comes down to this result. And so Arizona becomes a Trump state by 0.9, Nevada, Republican Trump state by 1 point, but Biden is expected, even with narrower margins, to win Pennsylvania by 1, Wisconsin by 1, and Michigan by 2. And so that's when these states actually move over into the lean Democratic column. When you take a look at North Carolina, Trump is up by 2.4. Georgia, Trump is up by 1. So what do? We characterize these states as such. Now, if we can take a look at some of the other states, Nebraska second is Biden plus 4. That's correct. Minnesota goes back to being likely blue. And so again, while the numbers add up a lot with what I'm saying, so do some of these margins. Trump wins Florida by 5. Let's continue through. Nebraska, likely, already there. Maine, likely. Ohio, back to likely. Texas, likely. Virginia, likely blue. Maine, second, likely. New Mexico, correct. Iowa, correct. Colorado, done. South Carolina, Alaska, narrowed down. The rest of these states really don't make a difference. And so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. But the point being here, that these margins and the predicted outcomes have largely been solidifying with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And we are seeing here that some of the states that, sure, are absolutely in play are less likely to go for President Biden than they were in 2020. This forecast shows probably the closest election we've been dealing with in a long, long time, right? You are talking about a close election similar to that of Vice President Al Gore and President George W. Bush. I mean, that is the type of election we are rolling towards. We are full steam ahead into an election that is going to come down to the wire, come down to every single battleground state and make a huge difference in the trajectory of this nation. Just as the 2000 election did, just as the 2024 election will. President Trump and President Biden are facing off in a very competitive race, and still President Biden has the upper hand. I think this is, again, something that has been reaffirming a lot of my suspicion that despite what the polls might be saying, the Democrats do very much have a very viable pathway to the presidency, and I do believe it is very, very clear. It relies on consistency and victories in Rust Belt states in ways that Democrats were only able to do under the Obama era. They need to expand on where President Biden was, and they need to be able to overcome the unpopularity rating of President Biden, the lack of enthusiasm for President Biden, and all of the other factors here that could be limiting a Biden victory in these battleground states, because they are the most important. And President Biden's pathway to 270 lies in it, and 538 recognizes that. I will leave you on this. 538 is a reputable source. I trust it a lot, and I think it does a lot of good things when it comes down to election discourse and just generally speaking, what we can understand and take a look at in this cycle. And so for 2024, when I see that President Biden has this upper hand, and while it may be narrow and it isn't statistically large enough to say that, you know what, this is a done deal, or at all, really, that President Biden is definitively going to have a higher chance of victory this coming November, but it is saying that he does have the slight advantage at this point, that President Biden is performing better, and arguably a lot better than what many other people might be suggesting. The election is certainly closer than it was in 2020, and maybe that could be seen as a failure on the Democratic Party side. That's a conversation for another day. But what I'm focused on is who is winning this election, and right now, that's President Biden. In my prediction, in 538's prediction, he has the upper hand. The question is, as this narrowing has begun when it comes down to the forecast over time, does President Biden hold on to this advantage? For months out, going into Labor Day, going into the general election season, does President Biden stand at this point in the advantage? While time will be, our best friend when it comes down to figuring that out, it'll be interesting to see what makes an impact on forecasts like these and who is actually driving in what direction and who will end up winning this coming November, according to 538. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.